Commander Jackson Orland leaned back in his chair, staring at the holoprojector in front of him. A series of reports from the Galactic Senate scrolled across the screen, each one more perplexing than the last. Earth, a fledgling member of the galactic community, had been under scrutiny for months. Its civilians, who had no military training, were somehow outperforming the elite forces of several advanced species in combat. The numbers didn't add up. How could a group of unrefined, untrained humans take down forces equipped with the most sophisticated weaponry and tactics in the galaxy? His mind raced as he flicked through the reports, each one more troubling than the last. The Senate had commissioned an investigation into Earth's civilian forces after multiple missions where civilians had exceeded even the most highly trained soldiers in kill counts. At first, the numbers seemed like a fluke. A few outliers, anomalies. But the more Jackson looked into it, the more it became clear there was something about Earth's people that was different. A sharp knock on the door broke his concentration. He didn't need to look to know who it was. "Enter," Jackson called out. The door slid open, and Lieutenant Mila Darren stepped inside. Her face was serious, the kind of look that spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. "Commander," she said, taking a seat across from him. "I've gathered the preliminary intel. It's worse than we thought." Jackson nodded, gesturing to the screen. "I know. We're getting reports from every corner of the galaxy. Civilians, just regular people from Earth, are outnumbering and outgunning elite forces from other species. It doesn't make sense." Mila sighed. "The Senate wants answers, Jackson. They're concerned. They think there's something unnatural about it. Like it's a hidden threat. Some of the higher-ups want Earth's forces neutralized before it becomes an issue." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I won't let that happen. Earth has earned its place in this galaxy. We need to figure out why this is happening before the Senate makes any rash decisions." Mila frowned. "You think it's just a fluke? Some kind of survival instinct?" "It's more than that. I've been reviewing the data, and I think it's not just the weapons or the training. It's the people themselves." Jackson paused. "Humans have an edge that no one's accounted for. A kind of unpredictability. The way they think, the way they react under pressure." Mila looked skeptical. "That doesn't explain the numbers, Commander. They're taking down entire squads of Zor-T warriors, some of the deadliest fighters in the galaxy. And they're not using anything special. No enhanced gear, no advanced training." Jackson leaned forward. "That's exactly the point. It's not the gear or the training. It's the mindset. Earth's civilians fight with a rawness, an instinct that no amount of training can replicate. It's desperation. It's survival." Mila's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting they're more dangerous because they're untrained?" Jackson nodded. "Yes. The elite forces from other species rely on their training, their strategies. But Earth's civilians? They don't have that luxury. They fight like they have nothing to lose, like every battle is their last. It's chaotic, unpredictable, and it gives them an edge in combat." Mila remained silent for a moment, processing what Jackson had said. "So you're telling me that these civilians are better because they're not bound by rules? No tactics, no strategy?" Jackson's expression was grim. "Exactly. They've been raised in a world where survival is a daily struggle. Earth is a planet in constant turmoil, wars, famine, disease. It's chaos, and that chaos has bred something different in its people. They fight with a desperation that no other species can match. And that desperation is what gives them the advantage." Mila shook her head slowly. "It still doesn't make sense. How can a bunch of civilians, who've never been trained, take down a whole squad of Zor-T soldiers? They're the best combatants the galaxy has ever known." "Because Earth's civilians don't know what they're up against," Jackson said quietly. "They don't have the luxury of fear. The Zor-T might be elite, but they're predictable. Earth's people, they're anything but." There was a long pause. Mila looked at the screen, the numbers continuing to scroll past her eyes. The kill counts, the mission logs, the casualty reports, they all pointed in the same direction. Earth's civilians were more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "This is going to be a problem, Jackson," Mila said softly. "The Senate won't be happy with this. They'll want answers, and they'll want to control Earth's military. You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm not playing any game," Jackson replied, his voice steady. "I'm trying to save Earth from being misunderstood. The Senate sees these civilians as a threat, but they don't understand why they're so effective. I'm going to figure that out. I have to. For Earth." Mila stood, nodding in agreement. "I'll gather more intel. I'll also talk to some of the civilian recruits, see if we can get some first-hand accounts of their training. If we can understand how they think, maybe we can explain it to the Senate." Jackson stood up as well, pacing for a moment. "I'll meet with the Senate, see if I can get their buy-in for a deeper investigation. But if they decide to shut this down, they'll have you to deal with," Mila finished with a small smirk. Jackson smiled grimly. "I won't let them make a decision out of fear. Earth deserves better than that." As Mila left the room, Jackson sat back down, his mind racing. He had a mission now, not just to save Earth's place in the galaxy, but to uncover what made its civilians so deadly. Something was buried deep within them, something that had yet to be understood by anyone. It was his job to find out what it was. Before the Senate made their final move. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Jackson's boots clicked against the cold metal floors of the research facility as he walked briskly down the corridor. He had been given access to classified military data, something he wasn't used to, especially not so soon after being assigned to Earth's investigation. The higher-ups in the Galactic Defense League had been reluctant to allow it, but the pressure from the Senate had forced their hand. Now, Jackson was deep in the data, more specifically, the combat simulations. He entered the briefing room, where his senior analyst, Sergeant Quinn, was hunched over a holographic console, working through the same reports. Quinn was Earthborn, a sharp and practical mind, with a no-nonsense attitude that Jackson admired. "Any new leads?" Jackson asked, pulling up a chair beside Quinn. Quinn didn't look up but gestured toward the projection. "The civilians are still outperforming the military elites, Commander. In some cases, it's not even close. I've cross-referenced these kill counts with mission success rates, and the civilians have a higher success rate by nearly 30%. It's unsettling." Jackson frowned. "This isn't luck. They're not just stumbling into success." "No," Quinn agreed, finally meeting his eyes. "They're resourceful, adaptive. But there's one thing we haven't accounted for: how they handle stress." Jackson's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Quinn tapped a few keys, and the projection shifted to a series of combat scenarios. These civilians, most of them are coming from war-torn regions, underprivileged areas. They're used to pressure. To fighting for their lives. They're not like our soldiers. Our elite forces, they train in controlled environments, where everything is predictable. These civilians? They've grown up in chaos. And that chaos, that's their strength." Jackson rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Survival instinct." "Yes. The kind of instinct that makes them capable of thinking on their feet, adapting quickly. When faced with danger, they don't hesitate. They don't panic, they act." Jackson's mind raced. This wasn't something any amount of training could replicate. It was raw, untamed potential. Earth's civilians weren't the strongest or the most advanced, but their willingness to fight through sheer will was unmatched. "But," Quinn continued, "it's not just the mental side of things. They're physically capable too. Some of these civilians come from backgrounds where they've been forced to fight or survive in brutal conditions. That's not something we train our soldiers for. You can't simulate poverty or war in a training facility." Jackson leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "They're forged by hardship, not training." "Yes," Quinn replied, "and that's what makes them dangerous. They don't rely on the kind of tech or gadgets we do. They fight with what's available to them. That unpredictability, the way they use the environment, their sheer refusal to back down, it's something that catches elite forces off guard. Jackson stood up, the pieces starting to come together. I've seen this in their missions. They're not following the rules. They're not using the conventional tactics we teach. It's chaos, and in that chaos, they thrive. Quinn nodded. It's why they're getting higher kill counts than our elite forces. They don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect shot. They take what they can get and make it work. A thought struck Jackson. So why aren't the military elites getting the same results? They're more highly trained, better equipped. Why can't they match that? Quinn's expression darkened. Because our elites are too reliant on their training. They've been conditioned to follow protocols, to wait for the perfect strategy. But when things don't go according to plan, they hesitate. They second-guess themselves. Civilians don't do that. They fight instinctively. Jackson paused, the weight of it settling in. The elites are too structured. They can't adapt. Exactly, Quinn said. And that's why the civilians are winning. They don't need to think. They don't need to plan. They just do. Jackson's mind began to race through the implications of this new understanding. The Galactic Senate had been worried about Earth's military potential, especially the civilians who had no formal training. But now, Jackson realized the Senate's fear was misplaced. Earth's civilians were not just unpredictable, they were a force the galaxy had never faced before. Where do we go from here? Jackson asked. Quinn didn't hesitate. We need to get more intel on these civilians, talk to them, see how they think. We've been focusing on their combat skills, but there's more to it than that. They're fighting for survival, and that's a mindset we've never fully understood. Jackson nodded. I'm meeting with the Senate in a few hours. I need something concrete to present. If I can't convince them that this is a strength, they'll just see it as a danger. We've got something, Quinn said, tapping the console again. I've been pulling together some reports from civilian encounters. The Zorati, for instance, they're one of the most advanced species in the galaxy. Their warriors are trained to be the best, yet civilians from Earth have taken down whole squads of them. And not just by accident. They're learning on the fly, adapting faster than anyone thought possible. Jackson clenched his fists. We have to get that message to the Senate. If we don't, they'll react out of fear, Quinn finished. And fear leads to rash decisions. Jackson exhaled, already dreading the Senate's cold reception. But this wasn't about them. This was about proving that Earth had the potential to stand tall beside the galaxy's greatest forces. It wasn't about technology or training, it was about survival, about raw determination, and about people who refused to back down. I'll handle the Senate, Jackson said firmly. But we need to show them what Earth is really made of. Quinn gave him a tight nod. You're right. And if we can't convince them with words, we'll show them with actions. Jackson's heart raced at the thought of what was to come. He was more determined than ever to prove that Earth's civilians weren't just a fluke, weren't just lucky, they were warriors, forged in the fires of adversity. The galaxy had underestimated them for too long. It was time for that to change. The room was tense, filled with the quiet hum of anticipation. Jackson stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the large display before him. The mission simulation was about to begin. He had arranged it carefully, and now everything was in place. A test to prove that Earth's civilians were more than capable of holding their own against the galaxy's elite. The stakes were high, not just for the soldiers involved, but for Earth's future in the galactic community. Behind him, the high-ranking officers from the Galactic Senate sat in silence. Their faces were unreadable, masks of diplomacy and scrutiny. They had been skeptical from the beginning, but this was it, the moment of truth. If the civilians could perform well in this live-fire exercise, Jackson would have the evidence to convince the Senate that Earth wasn't to be feared or underestimated. It wasn't just about strength, it was about adaptability, resourcefulness, and raw determination. The civilians will be pitted against our best, Jackson said, turning to face the Senate representatives. A simulation of a live invasion, using real enemy forces. The objective is simple: survive, adapt, and complete the mission. He caught the skeptical glance of High Senator Korak Thalrax. The Zora-T leader's piercing yellow eyes bore into him with an intensity that made Jackson's jaw tighten. Korak had never believed in Earth's potential, and it was clear that today, he was hoping to see a failure. Jackson wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. The command room's doors slid open, and the first group of civilian volunteers entered. They were a ragtag assortment, young men and women from all walks of life, most of them with little formal military training. A few carried basic rifles, some just handguns, others equipped with only their wits and what little they had been taught by Earth's elite forces. There was a quiet determination in their eyes. They were about to show the galaxy what they were made of. Jackson watched as they took their positions in the simulation. The Zora-T forces, fully equipped with advanced armor and weapons, lined up on the opposite side. A perfect test of what he had been preaching, the raw instincts of Earth's people against the calculated precision of the galaxy's elite. Simulation initiated, a voice echoed in the room. The virtual battlefield unfolded before them, a dense urban landscape, abandoned buildings, and the remnants of a once thriving city. The Zora-T forces immediately fanned out, using their superior technology to control the flow of the battle. They moved like a well-oiled machine, precision in every step. The civilians, on the other hand, had no such advantage. They weren't running on technology or advanced tactics. They relied on something different, something Jackson had only begun to understand. "Stay low," one of the civilians whispered to another, his voice tight with tension. "Use the buildings for cover. Don't engage unless we have the upper hand." The civilians immediately split into smaller groups, using the environment to their advantage. They didn't rush into battle. They waited, patient, calculating. Jackson could see it. This was not the mindless charging of inexperienced recruits. This was survival, stripped of all artifice. The first shots rang out. The Zora-T fired with precision, their energy weapons lighting up the night. But the civilians were faster, ducking behind rubble and buildings, firing from the shadows. They didn't need to be accurate. They just needed to make sure the Zora-T couldn't get a clear shot. One of the Zora-T soldiers advanced, confident in his armor and training. But he didn't anticipate the civilian strategy. A group of 3 young men, using nothing but their surroundings, set a trap. They lured the Zora-T soldier into an alleyway and, in a blur of motion, dropped him in seconds. It was quick, brutal, and effective. No finesse, no formal tactics, just raw aggression and adaptability. Korak shifted in his seat. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Jackson didn't take his eyes off the display. The civilians were holding their own, and the more he watched, the more convinced he became. The Zora-T forces were too rigid in their approach. They relied on training and superior tech, but Earth's civilians fought with something else, a primal edge. The simulation escalated quickly. More Zora-T soldiers arrived, and the battlefield became a chaotic mess of gunfire and explosions. The civilians didn't flinch. They adapted, moving quickly between buildings, setting ambushes, and using every advantage they could find. One of the civilian teams had been cornered in a derelict building, their ammo running low. Jackson's heart raced. This was the moment, the breaking point. Would they fold under pressure? Or would they rise to the challenge? A civilian woman, barely 20, made the call. "We're not waiting to die," she shouted. "We fight." She and her team, outgunned and outnumbered, launched a counteroffensive. With quick thinking, they used grenades to disable the Zora-T tech and created a diversion. It was messy, uncoordinated, but it worked. The Zora-T forces faltered, unable to keep up with the unpredictability of the humans. Jackson's eyes were wide. This was it, the moment that proved what he had been saying all along. Earth's civilians weren't just fighters, they were survivors. Korak stood up abruptly. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice sharp and commanding. This is chaos. There is no strategy, no order. It's pure madness. Jackson's heart skipped a beat, but he stood his ground. Exactly. And that's why it works. It's not about order. It's about doing whatever it takes to survive. The simulation ended, and the room fell silent. The Zorati forces had been pushed back. The civilians were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they were alive. One of the Senate representatives turned to Korak. It seems, Senator, that these civilians are more resourceful than we gave them credit for. Korak's expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. He turned to Jackson. This is an anomaly. A fortunate turn of events. It doesn't change the fact that these civilians lack discipline. Jackson didn't flinch. No, Senator. It changes everything. Earth's civilians have something your elite forces don't have, an edge born of desperation. They fight with a will to survive that you can't train into someone. It's not an anomaly. It's who they are. The room was silent as the weight of his words settled in. Korak took a deep breath, his eyes lingering on Jackson for a moment longer. This is not over. But Jackson knew the battle had already been won. He had shown the Senate what Earth's people were capable of. The civilians weren't a threat, they were a force to be reckoned with, and the galaxy would have to accept that. The silence in the Senate chamber was palpable. Jackson stood at the front, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on the faces of the high-ranking officials seated before him. Behind him, the results of the simulation still lingered in the air, heavy with the proof that Earth's civilians had far exceeded expectations. The room was still in shock, the echoes of the battle's unpredictability reverberating in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Senator Korak Thalrax broke the silence, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Commander Orlan, he said, his tone ice-cold, you have provided us with unexpected results. But this is not what the Galactic Senate needs. This, he gestured to the large screen displaying the chaotic but successful civilian maneuver, is not discipline. It is not order. It is chaos. Jackson stood firm, refusing to be shaken by Korak's condemnation. What you call chaos, Senator, is simply a different way of fighting. A way that doesn't rely on predictability and rigid structures. My people fight to survive, and they do so with the tools they have, in ways no one can anticipate. Korak's yellow eyes glinted with frustration. Survival does not equate to strength, Commander. It is a measure of desperation. Desperate creatures are dangerous, but they are not powerful. The galaxy does not need creatures who act without forethought. Jackson's hands tightened into fists behind his back. You underestimate them. The very desperation you dismiss is the strength of humanity. Earth's civilians have been forged in a world where survival is a daily struggle. You call it chaos, but I call it instinct, adaptability, and grit. Things your elite forces don't even know how to value. The Senate chamber was still, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. The other representatives shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Some looked at Korak for guidance, others seemed to consider Jackson's words with an open mind. High Senator Lethan, an elder and respected figure among the council, spoke next, her voice slow and deliberate. Commander, while we cannot ignore the results of the simulation, we must question whether Earth's method of fighting is sustainable. Your civilians, how long will they be able to perform in this manner? What happens when the battle turns against them? What happens when their survival instincts fail them? Jackson met her gaze unflinchingly. Their instincts will never fail them, Senator. You see, that's the difference between them and your forces. Your warriors rely on perfect execution, perfect timing, and perfect strategy. When things don't go as planned, they hesitate. Earth's civilians don't hesitate. They adapt. That's what makes them different. Lethan's expression softened, but her skepticism remained. And yet, there are risks. Unpredictability breeds instability. A force that cannot be controlled is a force that might one day turn on its own. Jackson took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. Every force in the galaxy can turn on its own. What's different about Earth is that our civilians are not driven by blind loyalty to a structure or authority. They fight because they have no other choice. They fight for family, for survival, for something deeper than any strategy or doctrine can offer. And that, he paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. That makes them far more reliable than you think. There was a brief silence before Senator Korak spoke again, his voice hard as stone. Commander, you speak with passion, but this is not about ideology. This is about security. The Galactic Senate cannot allow Earth's unpredictability to threaten the stability of the entire galaxy. We need order. We need control. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he stood tall. If you think Earth's unpredictability is a threat, then you have already decided that we are not worthy of being part of this galaxy. You're afraid of us, and that's why you won't see the truth. The room fell silent again, and for a moment, no one spoke. Jackson could feel the weight of the Senate's gaze upon him, could feel the fear and the resistance swirling in the chamber. Korak's disdain was clear, but it was more than that. There was something else in his eyes, something deeper, darker, that Jackson had seen in the Zora-T before. It wasn't just fear of Earth's power. It was the fear of losing control. Jackson took another step forward, his voice steady and clear. I didn't come here to argue. I came here to show you that Earth's civilians are not a liability. They are a strength. The same strength that has allowed us to survive on a planet that constantly fights to destroy us. If you want Earth to be a part of this galaxy, you need to understand that. And you need to accept it. Korak stood, his posture rigid. You've made your case, Commander. But the Senate is not easily swayed by words. We need more than that to trust your people. Jackson nodded. Then we'll give you more. You'll see our strength firsthand. Korak's eyes narrowed. And what do you propose, Commander? What could you possibly do to prove that these civilians are not a threat to the galactic order? Jackson didn't hesitate. A demonstration. A mission. A real-world test. A mission where Earth's civilians are put to the ultimate test, no simulations, no controlled environment. Just Earth's people against real opposition. The Senate members exchanged uneasy looks, but none spoke up. Korak's lips curled into a tight, calculating smile. And what makes you think we would agree to such a thing? Jackson met his gaze directly. Because you need to know the truth, Senator. You need to see for yourselves that Earth's civilians are not a threat, they're an asset. If you want Earth to be a part of the galaxy, you need to accept that. And if you can't, then you'll have to face the consequences of your fear. Korak's smile faded. You would risk everything for this? Jackson didn't flinch. I would risk everything to show you that Earth is more than what you think it is. For a long moment, the room was still. Then, finally, Korak spoke, his voice cold but not without respect. Very well, Commander. If you wish to prove your point, we shall allow you this demonstration. But understand this, if your civilians fail, if they show themselves to be as dangerous as we suspect, there will be no place for them in this galaxy. No place for Earth. Jackson stood tall, his heart pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. Then we will succeed, Senator. You'll see that we are more than just survivors. With those words, Jackson turned and walked out of the chamber, the fate of Earth hanging in the balance.